Hi. Hello, everybody. How are you?
Fine, great.
Okay, so my talk, let's see if we can center a little bit this. You mind?
Yes. Yes.
So my talk is about this notion of Chirakasha, which basically means it's a Sanskrit compound which combines chit, consciousness, one word for consciousness. Of course, we have so many in Sanskrit. And space, akasha, we have many words, but this one pops up in many texts, especially the Mokshapaya Yoga Vasishta tradition, which I'll be focused more on later on. But my talk will be mostly introductory to this confluence between space and consciousness that we find in Indian literature. And you may ask, sometimes I receive this question, why space and consciousness? What do you mean? So I started with early Vedanta. So if you study Vedanta, you'll see in the Upanishads, we have these moments in which Brahman is compared to a space, to Akasha. And then we also find that in early Buddhism, in the Pali canon, the early texts, in the Nikayas, we have this sort of phenomenological approach, this meditational aspiration. The Buddha is said to have experienced a realm of space in the jhanas, the four formless achievements, sometimes it's called. Later tradition criticizes that as they say in the Theravada tradition that maybe the Buddha learned this from Brahmanical teachers. So that's interesting. There's in the Upanishads, it seems that the Buddha and Brahmins and yogis were very close to each other. Also Jains, of course, and others, shamanic traditions were experimenting with the realms of consciousness. And in one of these realms, apparently space was very important. So that got me thinking, right? And then I also, my background is in European continental philosophy. And I love to read about St. Augustine, Bergson, Heidegger, why they were so obsessed with time. What about space, right? Maybe that's because European monotheisms, Judeo-Christianity, Judeo-Christian and Islamic traditions focus a lot on time. But space is also there, right? Space is also important. But even mystical traditions, right, they tend to say that their religious experience stands beyond space and time. But does it, right? Isn't it the case that religious or mystical experience has also its own time and its own space? We find this in discussions among Indian scholars, even Narayana Gupta, Utpaladeva, they have a place in which they say experience stands beyond space and time. But then other times you find scholars saying, well, space could be Brahman, could be Shiva. That's where I work. That's what I'm researching on. And let's move on to how do I.
So the top one, the arrow, the top arrow. Yeah, no, just change.
Oh, there. So this is part of my research I'm doing right now in the south of India, in Tamil Nadu. So I'm a Fulbright Nehru research scholar, and I'm affiliated at l'École Française d'Extrême-Orient of Pondicherry. So I'm currently pursuing the hypothesis that this notion of space and consciousness, though highly esoteric, was spread throughout India sometime at the turn of the millennium. But first, let me say that in Hindu tantric texts and this massive corpus we have of the Mokshapaya, popularly known as the Yoga Vasishta or the Yoga of the Sages Vasishta, we often encounter something akin to metaphysics, a phenomenology, and an ontology of cosmic consciousness that is encapsulated in this concept of Chirakasha, literally consciousness space, or the space of consciousness, or the notion that consciousness, chit, is of the nature of space, Akasha. The meaning of this space takes on different interpretations and metaphorical, mythopoetic embodiments, partly due to this ambiguity of the Sanskrit language, which we also found in many Indo-Tibetan languages, which is those words connoting space, like Akasha, Vyoman, Gagana, Ambara, can also be taken as ether, sky, so on. So it can be used within the literally or religious context, sometimes referring to either atmospheric phenomena or the heavenly realms where the gods live, as well as within sophisticated philosophical discourses and contemplative, yogic, and tantric environments. So out of this ancient, complex semantic and cultural network, a unique conception of the divine emerged in India, by which God or the goddess could be said to have, in addition to an anthropological form, a murti in the temple that devotees can relate to, a formless aspect reflecting a metaphysical intuition of the divinity as being either vast and expansive like the sky, or empty like space, having a body made of cosmic space, akasha shariram, or being of the nature of consciousness and space. So in my work in the South, I focus on this temple, Chidambaram, here in Tamil. You can read Ponambalam. It's the golden roof. Why Chidambaram? Chidambaram is actually Chidambara. It's a synonymous of Chidakash. Let me find also Chidyoman, Chidgavana. So why this temple was called like that? That's one of my questions. We don't know exactly when, but I argue maybe at some point in the 12th century or so. So although relatively rare in Sanskrit literature, this compound appears dozens of times in the Yoga Vasishta corpus and in many important Shaiva works. It shows up like once in the Abhinavagupta Tantraloka, the magnus opus of him. Nowadays, the Chidambaram temple is popularly known for hosting an invisible Akasha Linga, said to be contained inside an empty chamber next to the central murti of the dancing Shiva Nataraja, representing the natural element of space, and standing together with other 4 Shiva temples in south of India, evoking the other 4 elements. In this sort of eco-religious philosophical schema of mainstream Shaivism, the space thought to be the subtlest natural element points to the formlessness of God as pure and cosmic consciousness. So you could see there the 5 Shiva temples in this. We see this 5 places, but they are there, the 5 temples, and then down there you can see there are like 270 temples that are sung by the Narayanas, by the Shaiva devotional poets of the 7th to the 9th century. So this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? And still nobody has figured out when, how this came to be, this idea that these temples are associated with the elements, and why Chidambaram is associated with the space. Still a bit of a mystery. That's what I'm working on, trying to figure out why. This idea of formlessness is very important for Shaivas in the South. They have a debate that sounds a lot like the Vedantins when they talk about Nirguna and Sarguna. They talk about Nishkala and Sakala. It's a bit different. Sakala is with parts and Nishkala without parts. But is usually translated as Arupa, as without form. So this is what happens at Chidambaram. They say in this temple, because of this empty room, Shiva appears Nishkala, without form, Arupa, and so on. The history of the translation of the term Akasha is also entangled with the history of Western esotericism, especially within the theosophical tradition and certain interpretations of modern science for its rendering as ether or ether, which until Albert Einstein was a common way of understanding cosmic space as filled with energy, either as divine energy or as physical electromagnetic waves. Despite the post-Einsteinian debunking of the ether concept as pseudoscientific, some physicists have recently reclaimed it arguing, for instance, that Einstein himself considered its usefulness long after his first rejection of the concept, and that it could be a key to reconciling quantum physics with general relativity. Now, some philosophers have rescued the term to argue for a theory of an all-pervasive consciousness. Just as the all ether field the universe, now consciousness fills it. In a 2008 lecture, American philosopher Paul Draper proposed a psychological etheric theory as an alternative theory of consciousness to the four standard ones. Sorry, this is about my research on the different. Oh, thank you. The different, let's say, moments in which Chidambaram becomes connected to Chidakasha, from the 12th century to modern times, and the popularity of the idea, basically. And here we have two papers, not very clear, but there's Paul Draper, who argues for this sort of idea that in order to understand the consciousness can be spread through the universe, we should think about this ether, right? So he offered the cases of mystics and religious absorption into God as empirical evidence for his theory. He also recommended taking seriously one of the central doctrines of the Vedanta school of Hindu thought, namely the doctrine that Atman is Brahman. In the school, Brahman, which stands for ultimate or fundamental reality, as well as for consciousness, is often made equivalent with Akash. An equivalence found for the first time in some of the oldest Upanishads, and later synthesized in the Brahma Sutra, which together with the Bhagavad Gita form the scriptural basis for the Vedanta tradition. This Vedantic equivalence is what P.C. Divanji, one of the pioneers of the Yoga Vasishta scholarship, called in 1945 the Brahma Akasha equation. This phrase makes evident the Advaita Vedanta roots of a notion that seems to blossom as a metaphysics of consciousness within the Yoga Vasishta corpus, in its particular development of this Chidakasha concept, which was then influenced by many other traditions, such as Shaiva Tantra, Vijnanavada, or Yogacara Buddhism. In my view, Draper's etherism, based on the intuition of what he calls an omnipresent mind, or his most recent panpsychotheism of 2017, is a form of cosmopsychism, which I argue can vastly benefit from taking seriously the notion of Chidakasha, consciousness space, or etheric consciousness, if we follow Draper's paper. On the other hand, this Chidakasha notion, aided by cosmopsychism, can become philosophically legible to contemporary audiences. Although some Indologists have noted its relevance and all-pervasiveness in Sanskrit primary sources, only one scholar until now, Bruno Loturco, of the Mokshopaya project, has singled out the Chidakasha as the central doctrine of the Mokshopaya, which was the original title of the Yoga Vasishta. However, he only stated this fact, but has not developed further the possibilities and consequences of such an idea. Renowned scholar of Hindu Tantra, Gavin Flood, has also noted the persistence of this notion in the Shakta or Goddess Center and Shaiva Tantric traditions that achieved their highest cultural momentum around 1,000 years ago in Kashmir, the same region and time in which the Mokshopaya was composed. However, he has not sufficiently linked this idea to the broader pan-Indian landscape, and the value in its phenomenological potential has remained on the metaphorological level of interpretation of Chidakasha as referring to the sky of consciousness, rather than cosmic space, or a space of consciousness. Yet key Shaiva scriptures, such as the Shiva Sutra, as well as the Mokshopaya itself, identify the essence of God, or Shiva, with consciousness. On certain occasions, consciousness was identified with cosmic space too. An important revealed in the scripture, a tantra known as the Vijnana Bhairava, makes explicit a form of spatial phenomenology. In that the consciousness of the yogi, the tantrika or meditator, is said to merge with or dissolve in space, sometimes by just contemplating the sky. This practice of the sky gazing is also found among certain tantric Buddhists, as in the Tibetan Dzogchen tradition. So the notion of Chidaka has a long history in India, going back to the first Sanskrit philosophical sources. We know of the Upanishads, was probably developed by medieval Tantric Shaivas, Shaktas, and Hatha yogis, and has thrived in the theology and metaphysics of the Indian Advaita Vedanta tradition to this day. For instance, in the Hindu Swami Narayana Sampradaya, they do develop this idea quite as much, which I recently found. And we also have these modern saints. I'm sure you've heard about Kundalini Master Bhagavan Nityananda, also associated with the Siddha Yoga and Shaiva Tantra traditions, whose teachings were published under the title the Chidaka Shagita. So the Buddhists too have often compared the nature of the Buddha's mind or the concept of emptiness, shunyata, with the space, especially in the non-dual traditions of Mahayana Buddhism, Tibetan Vajrayana, Tathagata Garva, etc. The main difference between these Buddhist and Hindu discourses perhaps lies in the emphasis that the latter places on consciousness, Chit, Chaitanya, Samvit, or Vijnana, as fundamental to the nature of reality, and thus it stands closer to contemporary definitions of panpsychism. At the same time, the former tends to understand this consciousness as temporal, non-fundamental, and a co-arising phenomenon, and thus the Buddhist discourse seems closer to the philosophical positions of cognitive enactivism or neurophenomenology. So the only philosophical theory, seems to me, we have at hand nowadays that can account for such a metaphysical sort of ontophenomenological artifact is, I claim, an alternative form of panpsychism known as cosmopsychism. Ironically, the origin of the term cosmic consciousness, which appears at the root of the modern definition of cosmopsychism, was probably coined via an encounter with the Mokshopaya through a Tamil version of the Yoga Vasishta, rendered in English by the Sri Lankan lawyer and translator Ponnambal Arunachalam. That's he wrote a lot by the end of 19th century. Arunachalam was related by Kintu Ananda Kumaraswamy, who I'm sure you've heard about, the art historian responsible for single-handedly making the image of the dancing Shiva a global icon well known in the West to this day. In a recent article on the issue of cosmopsychism, Donaldo Ganetti has credited philosopher Edward Carpenter with the first usage of the English phrase cosmoconsciousness at the beginning of the 20th century, which he allegedly invented during his travels to India and Sri Lanka, and through his interactions with an Indian sage by the name Ramaswamy and the said scholar Arunachalam. Carpenter coined the term years before Richard Morris' book wrote it down in his 1901 publication, Cosmic Consciousness, a study in the evolution of the human mind, which William James popularized by integrating into his writings and speeches. Another phrase related to this, adopted in the early 20th century, to talk about Eastern mysticism was the oceanic feeling, penned by the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1915, Romain Rolland, reflecting on the Bengali saying Sri Ramakrishna, conveying the notion that in religious or mystical experience, consciousness becomes vast as or attains union with universal space. This static or trance feeling was commented by Sigmund Freud, who was a friend of Roland, but understood this very differently as a regression into a pre-egoic and infantile state of consciousness. Interestingly, the Mokshopaya and the Yoga Vasishta often describe consciousness as an infinite ocean whose superficial waves give rise to the universe. So one of Edward Carpenter's reasons for waves. So one of these are some quotes. I'm sorry, they're a bit like aligned. Quotes from the Mokshopaya. We'll read later, not now, but I just want to leave them there. So one of Edward Carpenter's reasons for coining the term cosmic consciousness was as a way to translate the term used by both Ramaswamy and Arunachalam, Jnana Akasha, meaning knowledge space, often utilized as synonymous of Chidaka. Notwithstanding these classical texts, which later received the title of the Yoga Vasishta, had been known in South India for centuries under different versions, one of which was entitled Jnana Vasishta, or the knowledge of Vasishta, Jnana Vasitam in its Tamil version. In one of its last chapters, Vasishta describes himself as Akasha Vasishta, literally a space Vasishta, or Vasishta, the one who is of the nature of space. And he is said to be this way because he directly knows in a radical non-dual way the nature of a space, which in the ultimate reality coincides with the nature of consciousness. Consequently, in this metaphysical literature, Jnana Akasha, or knowledge space, is an essential attribute of the wisdom of the sage Vasishta, who embodies the understanding of the realization of cosmic consciousness. What Ganeri ignored in his paper is this forgotten linkage to the Yoga Vasishta corpus and to the Chidakasha notion, which Carpenter's interlocutors knew through their reading and oral knowledge of these sources, and thus their understanding of the Chidakasha. So the purpose of my research here is thus to contextualize and situate this consciousness space notion, never thematized before, within the broader history of Indian philosophy and religion. And second, to propose that cosmopsychism can philosophically articulate for a modern audience this medieval pan-Indic idea. This notion, I argue, can contribute to the philosophy and the science of consciousness by offering an ancient Indian perspective rarely pursued in Western philosophy, usually more preoccupied with time than space, but that has specific resonances with the work of some Christian theologians who thought that, like Sir Isaac Newton, the mystery of space should be integral to the knowledge of God, or that space, as he said, was God's sensorium. Cosmopsychism has certain similarities with the theologies of pantheism and panentheism too. It's true, we've heard before. Yet it differentiates from them in its non-theological, but rather metaphysical, ontological, and even phenomenological commitment to a cosmic consciousness that is embedded in or even constitutes space. And as I argue, is this precise aspect that the concept of Chidakasha highlights, as developed in the Mokshopaya, the Yoga Vasishta, and certain Shaiva, Yogic, and Tantric traditions. In the Yoga Vasishta corpus, for instance, we encounter a fascinating dialogue between the god Shiva and Vasishta, in which the sage asks the god, which one among all the gods, all the known gods, is the great god, the ultimate and only god? Right? Please tell me. Shiva answers in this apophatic manner, known as negative theology, that it is not him, nor any god with any known form, but consciousness itself, a natural, endless, objectless, and beginningless consciousness, the ultimate cause of the universe, which permeates, and fills cosmic space, like the forgotten ether, sustaining the fabric of reality, and which is nothing but the Chidakasha, or the space of consciousness. Shiva adds in the end of this chapter that it is this consciousness only that is worth worshipping, and it is a consciousness that is also experienced. How much time I have?
7 minutes.
7 minutes, okay. So to a certain extent, one can argue that most of the Mokshopaya is a poetic narratological exposition of the experience and the views of Siddhas. So the characters of these texts are mostly realized Siddhas who have had an experience of the nature of reality and then explain it to somebody. Right? This, of course, happens within lots of incredible stories of dreams, impossible dreams, and things happening. But the main characters, the main teachers are Siddhas who have a particular experience. And most of them always say, I have merged with space, right? And one case is Vitahavya. Vitahavya, whose chapter, first chapter is called the Nirvana Yoga of Vitahavya. So there's a lot of Buddhist terminology, but it's reused in a way that transcends sectarian boundaries. There's an almost yeah, we could read a few passages here. I have Um, so there is this insistence that this consciousness is natural versus a fabricated consciousness, right? The word is akritrima, which is a word that is favored by Kashmiri Shaivas, right? So natural versus fabricated. And this naturalness of consciousness has to do with not having objects. Very interesting. And also being immaterial or non-material. In English, I think immaterial doesn't have the same connotation. We have more examples in which so the Chirakasha is a way to affirm this fundamentality of consciousness in the cosmos, that the cosmos, the space of the cosmos is filled with consciousness, and finally that the individual consciousness can connect, can merge somehow with this universal consciousness through experience. That's all over the place. Anyway, and I think I can leave it here. And if you have any questions, thank you.